Las Vegas Convention Center, Nevada, September 18, 1972. The backstage corridors smelled like sweat trapped inside old velvet curtains, cigarette ash mashed into carpet fibers, cheap cologne trying to overpower blood memory. 1,100 people pressed against the arena walls waiting for the heavyweight exhibition to begin, while loaders dragged lighting rigs through narrow hallways that trembled every time the crowd stomped overhead. This building had hosted title fights, mob collectors, Elvis rehearsals, broken jaws, broken marriages. But tonight, something would happen that the Las Vegas Convention Center had no category for. The story that cornerman Eddie Morales would tell for the next 50 years began with a mop bucket rolling across polished concrete. The backstage service corridor underneath the Las Vegas Convention Center had the emotional temperature of a boiler room. Too many men moving too quickly. Too much stale air trapped beneath low concrete ceilings stained yellow by decades of cigarette smoke. The building itself seemed to sweat. Pipes clicked overhead. Somewhere deeper inside the structure, metal platforms groaned under the weight of television equipment being rolled into place for the heavyweight exhibition. September 18, 1972, 7:13 in the evening. A janitor cursed softly in Spanish after dropping a ring wrench beside a stack of folded chairs. Someone laughed. Someone else shouted for ice. The smell was layered: bleach, bourbon, damp canvas, old adrenaline. You could stand still for 10 seconds and identify 3 different galons and at least one man having a panic attack. And through all of it walked Bruce Lee carrying a mop bucket. Not metaphorically, literally. Gray work pants, dark short-sleeve shirt already damp across the spine. Sleeves rolled once above the forearms. No sunglasses, no dramatic entrance. His hair slightly flattened from humidity. In one hand, he carried a yellow maintenance bucket with rust scratches along the rim. In the other, a folded push broom borrowed from one of the exhausted cleanup workers setting up after a trade expo earlier that afternoon. Nobody looked twice. That was the strange part later. The detail witnesses remembered most. Nobody looked twice, because fame behaves differently backstage. Under arena lights, Bruce Lee was becoming myth already. Magazines, television appearances, whispered stories among martial artists who spoke his name the way Catholics whispered saints. But behind curtains, inside utility corridors, fame dissolved into labor. Men became silhouettes carrying equipment. And Bruce looked tired. Not weak. Never weak. But tired in the way panthers probably look tired. Coiled exhaustion. Controlled fatigue. His movements economical enough to appear casual until you noticed he never collided with anything. Not once. Men rushed past him carrying cables and somehow missed him by inches every single time. Like water curving around stone. A lighting technician named Raymond Pike noticed first. Years later, he would describe it strangely. He walked like his body already knew where the world was moving before the world moved. Not fear, not nervousness, something else. Bruce paused beside a catering table littered with half-eaten sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Someone had spilled mustard across the edge. He set the mop bucket down gently and glanced toward the arena entrance, where the muffled roar of 1,100 spectators pulsed through concrete walls like distant artillery. Heavyweight crowds sounded different from movie crowds. Movie crowds screamed. Fight crowds waited. The waiting carried appetite. A young security guard walked past Bruce without looking directly at him. "Kylops through there," he muttered, jerking his thumb toward the west tunnel. Bruce nodded once. No correction, no ego. That mattered later too, because another man would have stopped him immediately. "Do you know who I am?" Bruce said nothing. The hallway vibrated suddenly as a freight elevator slammed open nearby. Voices spilled outward, loud voices, thick East Coast accents, men performing toughness for one another. Then came the heavyweight champion, 6'5", 243 pounds. Broad enough to make door frames look decorative. His name was Leon Hammer Barlow, though sports writers preferred calling him the Iron Locomotive, which he secretly hated. He entered the corridor wrapped in a camel-colored overcoat. Despite the heat, gold watch gleaming beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly dead. 3 handlers followed behind him carrying garment bags and ice packs. The corridor changed instantly. That happens around dangerous men. Space reorganizes itself. Conversations lowered in volume. Workers subtly stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. A nervous production assistant accidentally pressed herself against the wall while clutching a clipboard to her chest. Barlow loved this effect. Loved it. His confidence fed on visible discomfort the way some fires feed on oxygen. 29 knockouts in 34 fights. 2 broken orbital bones inflicted in televised bouts. Rumors of unpaid gambling debts trailing him from Chicago to Atlantic City. Men like Barlow survived by making every room emotionally smaller for everyone else. And tonight he was already angry. A reporter earlier that afternoon had compared his footwork unfavorably to younger fighters. One newspaper even suggested he looked heavy around the hips. That sentence had stayed lodged inside his skull all evening like glass beneath skin. So when he saw Bruce standing near the catering table holding cleaning equipment, his brain categorized him instantly: worker, invisible, disposable. Barlow kept walking until his shoulder clipped Bruce hard enough to spill dirty mop water across the concrete floor. The bucket clattered sideways. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the corridor. Several people turned. Bruce looked down calmly at the spreading water. Not angry, not submissive either, just observant. The heavyweight champion barely slowed. "Watch where you're standing," Barlow muttered. Bruce crouched silently and lifted the bucket upright again, one hand steadying the handle. Fingers lean and veined beneath fluorescent light. Someone's cigarette continued burning, forgotten in an ashtray beside the catering table. No music, no dramatic tension yet, only little sounds. Dripping water, shoes squeaking across concrete. Far away, the crowd upstairs beginning to chant the champion's name in rhythmic waves. "Barlow! Barlow! Barlow!" Bruce glanced once toward the heavyweights retreating back, then toward the wet floor, then calmly reached for the mop, and something about the silence around him began changing shape. Leon Barlow's dressing room sat at the far end of the west corridor beneath a flickering exit sign that buzzed faintly like an insect trapped inside glass. The door remained half open while trainers moved in and out carrying Vaseline tubs, gauze rolls, bottled water, confidence. Inside, somebody laughed too loudly at one of Barlow's jokes. The kind of laugh employees use when rent depends on another man's mood. Outside, Bruce Lee pushed the mop slowly across concrete, long strokes, deliberate. Water spread thin beneath fluorescent reflections. A stagehand named Curtis Wynn would later swear the entire hallway became quieter after the bucket spilled. Not immediately, gradually, like people unconsciously lowering themselves into church voices. Because something about Bruce contradicted the costume. Janitors slouched. Laborers dragged exhaustion behind them. Men invisible to the wealthy developed a particular rhythm, apologetic shoulders, eyes lowered, movements shaped by avoidance. Bruce had none of that. Even holding a mop, he occupied space differently, balanced, centered. His spine straight without stiffness, neck loose, breathing almost suspiciously calm. Every few minutes, his eyes lifted briefly toward movement around him, not darting nervously but measuring. Calculating distance unconsciously the way musicians hear tempo without counting. A pair of young boxers warming up near the utility stairs noticed him. One whispered, "That Chinese dude looks familiar." The other shrugged. "Probably works here." Then Barlow emerged again, this time wearing fight trunks beneath an open robe stitched with gold threading across the shoulders. The heavyweight champion looked enormous under corridor lighting. Neck thick as poured cement, hands hanging low beside his hips with the heavy stillness of wrecking balls. His entourage spilled around him in a moving crescent. Trainer, cornerman, cutman, 2 local promoters smelling of cigars and expensive panic. Barlow stopped mid-stride when he saw Bruce still mopping near the dressing room entrance. A tiny thing, meaningless almost. But humiliation accumulates strangely inside proud men. Earlier criticism from reporters, anxiety before performance, cameras waiting upstairs, fear hidden beneath aggression. All of it searching for somewhere weaker to land. And Bruce, quiet, unimpressed, unintimidated, became available gravity. Barlow tilted his head slightly. "You still here?" Bruce looked up once. "Yes." No explanation. Just yes. The champion smirked at the people around him, expecting shared amusement. He received it instantly. Little obedient chuckles bounced through the corridor. One promoter muttered, "Guy barely speaks English." Another laugh. Bruce returned to mopping. That irritated Barlow more than open disrespect would have, because dominance requires participation. Anger needs resistance to feel satisfying. But Bruce moved with the emotional neutrality of weather. No visible embarrassment, no eagerness to appease, nothing. A strange stillness settled across the hallway. Barlow stepped closer, too close. "You got hearing problems?" he asked. Bruce leaned the mop gently against the wall. Now nearby workers started pretending not to watch. An electrician adjusted cables without adjusting cables. A makeup assistant froze beside a supply cart holding powder brushes motionless in her hands. Someone stopped chewing halfway through a sandwich. Crowds form before violence, the way birds gather before storms. Bruce answered quietly. "You need this hallway?" Barlow blinked once. Not the words he expected. "What? You seem upset to see me standing here." The corridor tightened. That sentence changed the chemistry completely. Because Bruce hadn't sounded defensive. He sounded curious. A dangerous difference. Barlow stepped forward until his robe nearly touched Bruce's chest. The size gap looked absurd now under direct lighting. 40, maybe 50 pounds difference. 8 inches in height. Bruce appeared almost narrow beside him. Smaller wrists, smaller shoulders. No visible intimidation tactics. No clenched fists. Yet witnesses later struggled describing why the balance of power suddenly felt unclear. The heavyweight champion smiled without warmth. "You backstage people got rules," he said. "Move when fighters walk through." Bruce nodded slightly. Then came the sentence Eddie Morales remembered for half a century. "I already moved," Bruce said. "Not aggressive. Not theatrical. Simple fact." The words landed strangely. Even Barlow seemed uncertain for a second what exactly had been challenged. Somewhere overhead, the arena crowd erupted briefly as announcers tested microphones. The sound rolled through ceiling beams like distant thunder. A cart full of bottled soda rattled past the far corridor entrance. Nobody in this hallway looked away. Barlow's trainer sensed danger first. Not physical danger yet, social danger. The heavyweight champion was losing emotional control in public view, and everyone nearby could feel it happening molecule by molecule. "Leon," the trainer muttered softly. "Forget this guy." But Barlow wasn't hearing trainers anymore. He was staring directly into Bruce's eyes now, and that part unsettled him, because there was no fear inside them. Not courage either. People misunderstand this. Courage is usually fear managed properly. Fighters recognize it immediately in one another. You see tension beneath bravado, adrenaline disguised as confidence. Bruce showed none. His eyes looked rested. That was the terrifying part. Rested eyes inside a confrontation. Barlow laughed suddenly too loud. "You some kind of comedian?" Bruce shook his head once. No, another silence, longer now. Someone's ice bag dripped steadily onto concrete nearby. Drip, drip, drip. The corridor had become a theater without permission. Workers subtly repositioned themselves for better sightlines while pretending to continue tasks. Human beings always sense when history might accidentally occur nearby. Barlow spread his arms dramatically toward his entourage. This little janitor thinks he's funny. More forced laughter, but weaker now, uncertain, because Bruce still wasn't performing submission correctly. He simply stood there, breathing quietly through his nose, while fluorescent light reflected softly off the wet floor around his shoes. Then the heavyweight champion made the mistake, the ancient mistake. He put both hands on Bruce's chest and shoved him backward, hard. Several witnesses gasped simultaneously. Bruce slid exactly one step. No stumble, no flailing recovery. Just one smooth backward movement absorbing force through hips and ankles like suspension cables absorbing wind. The crowd upstairs continued chanting, "Barlow! Barlow! Barlow!" But down here beneath the arena, another rhythm had begun forming entirely. At first, nobody believed a fight was actually going to happen. That's important. Memory lies afterward. People rewrite tension into inevitability because inevitability feels cleaner than confusion. But inside that backstage corridor, in the exact seconds after Leon Barlow shoved Bruce Lee backward, most witnesses still assumed the moment would dissolve into embarrassment and separation. Somebody would apologize. Security would intervene. The little janitor-looking man would disappear down another hallway, carrying his mop bucket like nothing happened. That's how reality usually behaves. Not tonight. Bruce steadied himself from the shove without visible effort. One foot touched down behind him softly, heel first. Then weight transfer. Then stillness. Complete stillness. The mop handle beside the wall vibrated faintly from the movement and settled. Barlow noticed something then. A tiny thing. Bruce had not blinked during the shove. The heavyweight champion's breathing changed almost immediately afterward. Witnesses described it differently, but all of them noticed. Shorter inhalations, chest expanding higher instead of deeper. The body preparing unconsciously for escalation. Bruce, meanwhile, looked almost relaxed. Not passive, relaxed. His arms hung loose beside his ribs, fingers slightly curled, shoulders dropped low. No boxing posture, no macho posing. If anything, he looked smaller now, less threatening. The way certain snakes flatten themselves before striking. A production assistant near the staircase whispered, "Who is that guy?" Nobody answered. At 3 seconds after the shove, Bruce glanced briefly at the heavyweight's feet. That mattered later. Barlow interpreted the glance as submission. Actually, Bruce was studying balance. Heavyweights carry gravity differently from smaller men. More torque in the hips. More delay during directional shifts. Barlow's lead foot pointed slightly outward. Evidence of old knee damage, probably medial collateral ligament strain from over-rotation during hooks. His center line leaned too heavily onto the front leg when emotionally agitated. Bruce saw all this instantly. Not consciously, perhaps. More like musicians hearing pitch. The corridor felt hotter suddenly. Somebody removed a suit jacket. A ring girl standing farther down the hallway stopped chewing gum midway through a bite. Her mouth remained slightly open without her realizing it. Barlow stepped forward again. "You think I'm playing with you?" Bruce answered softly. "No, I think you're angry." The sentence hit harder than an insult, because it diagnosed rather than challenged. People can endure mockery. Diagnosis cuts deeper, especially proud men. Barlow's entourage shifted uneasily behind him now. Trainers exchanged quick glances. One promoter quietly backed toward the wall. Another looked around for security, but did not call for it yet because male pride has gravity of its own. Nobody wanted to become the first man admitting the situation felt dangerous. And still Bruce had not adopted a fighting stance. That unnerved everyone. Violence usually announces itself physically. Fists rise, chests tighten, adrenaline leaks visibly through posture. But Bruce looked almost conversational standing there beneath fluorescent lights, with damp mop water, still pooled near his shoes. Someone's cigarette finally burned down completely in the ashtray beside catering. Thin gray smoke curled upward. Forgotten. At 6 seconds after the shove, Barlow laughed again, though there was less confidence inside it now. "You know who I am?" Bruce nodded once. "Yes, then maybe you know I can break your neck." Bruce tilted his head slightly. "No," he said quietly, "you can try." Silence, absolute silence. Even the noises from upstairs seemed farther away suddenly. The arena chants blurred into dull vibration beneath concrete. Nobody in the corridor moved. Human beings possess ancient instincts around imminent violence. Entire nervous systems synchronize unconsciously. A lighting technician later described the feeling perfectly. It was like the hallway stopped breathing. Barlow took another step forward. Bruce did not move. The size difference looked impossible now, almost grotesque. Barlow's shoulders blocked portions of the overhead light. His fists were massive, scarred across the knuckles from years of heavy bag work and bar fights that reporters never heard about. He outweighed Bruce by at least 60 pounds. Yet several witnesses later admitted something disturbing. The closer Barlow moved toward Bruce, the less dominant he appeared. Not physically, energetically, because Bruce's calmness created contrast. The heavyweight's aggression began looking emotional instead of powerful, sloppy instead of controlled. The entire confrontation inverted itself psychologically. Barlow sensed it happening too. That's why rage accelerated. At 9 seconds after the shove, the heavyweight champion jabbed a finger hard against Bruce's chest. "You think Kung Fu makes you tough?" Bruce glanced down briefly at the finger touching him, then back up. "No," he said. Another pause. Then understanding makes you tough. Nobody forgot that line afterward. Not because it sounded cinematic, because Bruce said it without performance. Quietly, almost sadly, Barlow's face changed. The corridor watched the exact moment humiliation overtook reason. A vein pulsed visibly near his temple, jaw tightening asymmetrically, pupils narrowing. Breathing now audible from several feet away. His body had entered combat stress without technical preparation. Dangerous for ordinary men, catastrophic for fighters dependent on emotional dominance. Bruce noticed every biological change. At 12 seconds, he shifted his own right foot backward exactly 4 inches. Tiny movement. Most people missed it entirely. But not Eddie Morales, the old cornerman standing beside the ice machine. Years later, Morales would demonstrate the movement repeatedly for reporters, always shaking his head afterward. "That's when I knew the big man was finished," he said. "Not hurt. Finished, because Bruce hadn't moved away. He had aligned himself." A wet metallic banging echoed suddenly somewhere deeper backstage as workers dropped part of a lighting scaffold. Several people flinched instinctively. Bruce didn't. Neither did Barlow. The heavyweight champion stared downward now with wounded animal intensity. He had stopped performing for the crowd. That layer was gone. No more joking. No more entourage laughter. Only ego cornered by something it couldn't categorize. Bruce looked like a janitor, sounded like a philosopher, stood like neither. Then came the moment everything crossed irreversibly into violence. Barlow grabbed Bruce by the shirt collar with one huge fist and snarled directly into his face. "Say something smart now." And Bruce, astonishingly, smiled. Not mockingly, not fearfully, almost compassionately, which somehow enraged the heavyweight champion more than hatred ever could. The attack began at exactly 14 seconds after Leon Barlow first shoved Bruce Lee. Eddie Morales checked later against the arena clock mounted above the West Corridor exit because the timing obsessed him afterward. Men who witness strange violence become historians accidentally. They replay details, searching for logic. 14 seconds. That was all the warning history received. Barlow's right shoulder twitched first. Tiny movement. Almost invisible beneath the heavyweight robe, sliding halfway off his frame. Bruce saw it instantly. Not the punch itself, the intention before the punch. The nervous system announcing commitment milliseconds ahead of motion. Fighters at elite levels don't react to strikes. They react to decisions, and Barlow had finally decided. The heavyweight champion released Bruce's collar and launched a right hook toward the side of Bruce's skull with terrifying commitment. Not a warning swing, not intimidation theater. Full rotational violence powered from the hips upward through the spine. 243 pounds. Momentum. Anger. Humiliation. Witnesses later described hearing the punch before seeing it. The sound of air collapsing around the fist. A heavy rushing noise like a fast train entering a tunnel. At 1 second into the attack, Bruce moved. Not backward. That detail shattered people afterward. He moved forward. 6 inches maybe. Inside the arc. His body rotated slightly left while his right foot cut diagonally across wet concrete in a movement so economical several witnesses missed it entirely. No wasted motion, no dramatic flourish. One fluid adjustment converting danger into geometry. Barlow's fist passed beside Bruce's face, close enough to disturb strands of hair near his temple. Missed. Barely. The heavyweight's eyes widened instantly because powerful men are psychologically unprepared for absence where impact should exist. At 2 seconds, Bruce struck. Not a punch first, a finger jab. 3 rigid fingertips snapping forward into Barlow's eyes with horrifying speed. Not enough to blind permanently, enough to interrupt vision and nervous system coordination simultaneously. Barlow recoiled instinctively. That recoil mattered more than pain. Because once balance broke, everything afterward became physics. The crowd in the corridor gasped as one organism. Someone shouted, "Jesus Christ!" Bruce pivoted immediately off his lead foot. At 3 seconds, his left palm crashed upward beneath Barlow's jawline. Not a wild strike, precise angle. The palm heel drove directly through the mandibular nerve region while forcing the heavyweight's head backward, violently enough to disrupt equilibrium in the inner ear. Barlow's massive body staggered sideways into the catering table, sandwiches and soda cans exploding across concrete. The table legs screamed against the floor. Bruce didn't pause. No celebration. No hesitation. At 4 seconds, he stepped again. Closer now, impossibly close. Inside the heavyweight's collapsing structure. His right elbow slammed into Barlow's floating ribs with a wet, muffled impact that several witnesses compared to a baseball bat striking soaked carpet. A terrible sound, deep, organic. Barlow grunted sharply as air evacuated his lungs. Not pain yet, shock. His nervous system struggling to understand how smaller mass kept generating catastrophic force. Bruce's breathing never changed. That frightened people most afterward. No strain, no rage, just efficient respiration through the nose, while violence unfolded around him like practiced calligraphy. At 5 seconds, the heavyweight champion attempted survival instinctively. Not technique anymore. Survival. He lunged forward trying to grab Bruce around the torso using sheer size advantage. Had he succeeded, the fight likely would have transformed into something uglier and longer. 240 pounds, collapsing onto concrete, can erase precision. But Bruce had already anticipated the grab. Of course he had. His body shifted sideways before Barlow's arms fully extended. Simultaneously, his left leg whipped low across the heavyweight's lead knee. Not flashy. Brutal. The oblique angle attack hyperextended the joint laterally just enough to collapse structural support without fully destroying the ligament. A tactical dismantling. Barlow's knee buckled violently. The giant dipped sideways. People screamed now. Not cheering. Fear. Real fear. Because the hallway no longer resembled a fight between men. It looked like one nervous system being systematically unplugged by another. At seconds, Bruce delivered the final strike. The famous one, though no two witnesses ever described it identically. Some claimed it looked like an inch punch. Others swore it resembled a short hook. Eddie Morales insisted Bruce barely moved at all. What everyone agreed upon was the sound. Bruce planted his feet, rotated his hips exactly once, and drove a compact right fist into Barlow's solar plexus from almost no visible distance. A short-range kinetic explosion, not muscular effort, chain reaction. Floor to ankle, ankle to hip, hip to spine, spine to shoulder, shoulder to fist. Perfect sequencing delivered through 6 inches of travel. The impact produced a hideous compressed thud that echoed off corridor walls. Barlow froze, completely froze. His eyes bulged wide with sudden incomprehension as the diaphragm spasmed violently. Human beings rarely understand what true systemic shock feels like until the body stops obeying commands entirely. The heavyweight tried inhaling and couldn't. Nothing came. No oxygen. Only panic. At 7 seconds, his legs gave way. All 243 pounds collapsed sideways into the wet concrete with seismic force. The corridor shook. Water from the overturned mop bucket spread beneath him in crooked rivers reflecting fluorescent light. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Bruce stepped backward once, breathing calm. Shirt collar torn slightly where Barlow had grabbed him earlier. That was all. No victory pose, no threats, no adrenaline shaking his hands. The heavyweight champion writhed on the floor, gasping soundlessly like a drowning man, pulled onto shore too late. Trainers rushed forward in chaos. One dropped to his knees beside Barlow, screaming for water. Another shouted for security. Someone else kept repeating, "What the hell was that? What the hell was that?" Bruce looked down quietly at the fallen giant. Not triumph, not cruelty, something closer to disappointment. Then he bent calmly, lifted the mop handle from the floor, and stood the yellow bucket upright again. The gesture stunned witnesses more than the violence itself, because it implied the fight had interrupted him. Nothing more. A ring girl near the staircase started crying softly, without understanding why. And overhead, beyond concrete ceilings and steel beams, 1,100 people continued chanting Leon Barlow's name, completely unaware that Backstage, the heavyweight champion, had already lost the most important fight of his life. For several seconds after Leon Barlow collapsed, nobody touched Bruce Lee. That detail stayed lodged inside witness memory like a splinter. Not because they were afraid exactly, because the human brain struggles after seeing certainty dismantled too quickly. The corridor had just watched 60 pounds of weight difference become meaningless, watched aggression fail against timing, watched a man built like industrial machinery crumple under movements so compact they barely looked violent at all. People needed time to reorganize reality. Barlow lay on his side wheezing against wet concrete, one massive hand clutching his abdomen, while trainers shouted contradictory instructions around him. Breathe. Don't move. Get water. Call a doctor. Panic ricocheted through the hallway in fragments. Bruce stood outside the panic entirely, still holding the mop handle. Someone later asked Eddie Morales what Bruce's face looked like afterward. Morales answered slowly, like a teacher whose students missed the lesson. Not anger, not pride. Something quieter. Bruce glanced once toward the heavyweight champion struggling for air, then toward the crowd of frozen onlookers gathering near the corridor entrance. Stagehands, security guards, makeup girls, young fighters pretending they understood what they had witnessed. They didn't. None of them did. Because boxing had taught them violence belonged to mass, to force, to intimidation. Heavyweight logic. Bigger man crushes smaller man. History repeats itself physically. Then Bruce Lee appeared dressed like maintenance staff and erased that equation in 7 seconds. A security supervisor finally pushed through the crowd. What happened here? Nobody answered immediately. Not because they lacked words. Because every available explanation sounded stupid out loud. Bruce broke the silence first. He slipped, he said softly. Several witnesses stared at him in disbelief. Not mocking, not joking. He genuinely seemed uninterested in humiliating Barlow further. That mattered. Cruel men savor victory publicly. Bruce almost appeared embarrassed by the attention now turning toward him beneath the fluorescent lights. He rolled the mop bucket carefully away from the spreading water, while trainers continued reviving the heavyweight champion behind him. Then, something extraordinary happened. Leon Barlow looked up from the floor directly at Bruce Lee. And the rage was gone. Completely gone. Pain remained. Shock remained. Humiliation certainly remained. But beneath all of it sat something unfamiliar inside the heavyweight's expression. Recognition. Not of celebrity. Of truth. Because for one impossible instant, lying there half-conscious against concrete, Barlow understood that strength and dominance were not the same species of thing. One belonged to flesh, the other belonged to understanding. Bruce had tried telling him, "Understanding makes you tough." The sentence returned now with almost spiritual cruelty. Somewhere upstairs, the fight announcer's voice thundered through arena speakers, introducing the evening's exhibition card. The crowd erupted again in distant cheers, unaware their champion still hadn't emerged from backstage. Bruce turned toward the service corridor leading outside. No dramatic farewell, no speech. He simply began walking, and once again people parted around him automatically. Not because he demanded space, because they no longer knew what he was. The janitor illusion had evaporated. But the movie star myth didn't fit either. Movie stars don't move like that, don't remain calm like that. Don't dismantle violence with the emotional detachment of surgeons. A young boxer near the staircase finally whispered the question everyone else was thinking. "Who the hell is he?" Eddie Morales answered quietly without taking his eyes off Bruce's retreating figure. "That," he said, "is a man who already fought himself before he fought anybody else." Years later, stories mutated. Some claimed Bruce knocked Barlow unconscious cold. Others exaggerated the confrontation into a backstage riot involving security teams and broken walls. Human memory inflates around mystery, especially in fight culture. But witnesses closest to the corridor kept repeating the same strange details. How calm Bruce seemed. How small he looked until movement began. How the heavyweight champion's confidence disappeared before the actual fight even started. And always, they mentioned the mop bucket. Because symbolism attaches itself naturally to unforgettable moments. A man mistaken for invisible labor exposing the fragility of visible power. A global icon moving anonymously through a world obsessed with appearances. A heavyweight champion discovering too late that intimidation stops working against people who have already conquered fear internally. Not victory, understanding. That was the real fight inside the corridor, beneath the Las Vegas Convention Center. in September 1972. And maybe that is why the story survived for so long, among fighters, trainers, old stagehands, forgotten witnesses drinking late-night coffee, in empty diners decades afterward. Not because Bruce Lee defeated a larger man. That happens sometimes. The story endured because he revealed something people spend entire lives avoiding. Most men mistake noise for strength. Bruce never did. And somewhere in the memory of that concrete hallway, beneath cigarette smoke, fluorescent light, and the fading echo of a heavyweight crowd chanting a broken champion's name, a yellow mop bucket still rolls softly across the floor.